We're going to focus now in on the modern sciences, the relation to disenchantment, and the questions of worldviews. And we're also going to revisit Weber's lecture, 1917 lecture on. Oh yeah, that's your notebook on Wissenschaft als Beruf. Because the natural sciences have often, I think, still are often singled out as main suspects for bringing about a perceived dissipation of meaning and mystery in modernity, a disenchantment of the world. And this view has certain roots in Weber's writings, but we owe, I argue, the more radical versions of it to late 20th century culture warriors or culture critics calling for a re-enchantment of the world and of nature. And in these narratives, the ascent of the natural sciences had produced a view of the world that was mechanistic, reductionist, materialist, and deterministic. And this scientific worldview that resulted had then annexed the old domains of religion and philosophy, and exiling meaning and spirituality and wonder in the process. One influential exponent of this view is Maurice Berman, a historian of science turned culture critic in the 80s. And reflecting on early 1980s America, he paints a very dire picture of the modern condition. It's a world of cultural disintegration and a collapse of traditional values, which gives rise to stupefying jobs, transient relationships, absurd politics, hysterical sects, and a retreat into drugs, television, and tranquilizers. The reasons for this misery were not, though, to be sought in socioeconomic or political conditions, according to Berman. Instead, the problem had originated with the scientific revolution. So before the scientific revolution, European civilization had rested on a participating consciousness that involved merger with one's surroundings. By contrast, the new mechanical philosophy and the Cartesian paradigm that came with the scientific revolution had brought about disenchantment and non-participation, bringing us, quote, the grim, scientific, totally controlled world of nuclear reactors, microprocessors, and genetic engineering. The only way out, as Berman saw it, was a revolution in the life of the mind through the adoption of a holistic worldview that replaces this mechanistic worldview of the sciences. Now, similar accounts to this are commonplace in the literature of so-called New Age science and contemporary spirituality. Polemical portrayals of a soulless, mechanistic technoscience are contrasted with the author's alternative, re-enchanted worldview. At the same time, this alternative is often said to be compatible with a new and emerging form of science, which is typically exemplified with certain cherry-picked references to quantum mechanics, parapsychology, or the study of consciousness and its alterations. So what I'm going to argue is that none of this is particularly original, that the caricature of soulless scientism, as well as the promise of a new spiritual science, are derivative of discussions about science, religion, and worldview that were carried out at the end of the 19th century and, more importantly, at the beginning of the 20th. So I will return to this in a few moments, but first we should also point out a striking contrast between Max Weber's view of science in his 1917 lecture and his later polemical uses of disenchantment narratives. And it concerns the very notion of a scientific worldview. Because a central point for Weber was that there can be no such thing as a scientific worldview. When he described the conditions of the disenchanted world, brought about not simply by science, but by a range of interlocking rationalization processes by which society was made more efficient, but also more complex and alienating, he addressed three dimensions that have a bearing on science's relationship to worldviews. The one that is most frequently quoted, at least in the context of discussions of disenchantment, was epistemological, that moderns no longer expect mysterious, incalculable powers to be at work in the world. A consequence of this being that empirical sciences should, in principle, be able to figure out all there is to know about the natural world, even if they may not have the answers yet. It's possible. But this optimism was curtailed by two distinct kinds of skepticism in Weber's lecture. Science, being precisely empirical, can know nothing of the ultimate nature of reality, so there's a metaphysical skepticism. Moreover, facts of nature can tell us absolutely nothing about values, meaning, or how to live our lives, so there is an axiological skepticism, a skepticism about meaning and values. So for Weber then, the issue was not so much that science spread some kind of inhumane worldview. It was rather that our greatest epistemic authority, namely science, must remain silent on the matter of worldviews. Neither did he hold that worldviews were altogether impossible, that we are condemned to some kind of nihilistic existence. The point was rather that those who turned to science for meaning were looking in the wrong place. Worldviews were entirely a matter of subjective conviction and choice, and one could still choose in the domains of philosophy and religion. As Weber put it somewhat sarcastically, the arms of the old churches are opened widely and compassionately for those who seek meaning there. So it's just go there, that's where you find it. And what one could not legitimately do, according to Weber, was to seek justification for one's worldview in science or in other objective criteria. In fact, another term that he uses in this lecture, an intellectual sacrifice was required to have meaning. So a humble recognition that one chooses to believe in spite of reasons for doing so. So Weber was, in a sense, a relativist about meaning. And it was for this reason that he also openly ridiculed those of his contemporaries who claimed that there were deep lessons about the mystery of existence to be found in scientific discoveries and theories. And this is the quote that I used in the abstract as well. So who, aside from certain big children who are indeed found in natural sciences, still believes that the findings of astronomy, biology, physics, or chemistry could teach us anything about the meaning of the world? And science is the way to God? Science, the specifically irreligious power, or gottfremde Macht, alien to God, that science today is irreligious, no one will doubt in his innermost being, even if he will not admit it to himself. A central theme in Weber's lecture was that of value-free science. Yet, as we sense in this quotation, the lecture itself was far from free from values. It was rather value-laden. It was directed to students and aspiring scholars in a Germany that was exhausted by war. It aimed to instill in its new generation a sense of what values ought to inform proper academic conduct. And it is in this essentially normative then context that it made sense for Weber to deride some of his contemporaries in the natural sciences as being big children, and to also to cast followers of the contemporary Lebensphilosophie movement as being some kind of spiritual narcissists, and also to criticize professors who displayed their politics from the lecterns as demagogues. They were all kind of overstepping the bounds of what you could properly do as a scholar or a scientist. And these normative aspirations are understandable when we consider the context of the lecture. Weber was worried about what he saw as a cult of experience that was rising among the youth movements, about the deep anti-intellectualism and the declinist narratives that were gaining ground. But a consequence of all this is also that the lecture's many quotable passages do not really provide us with accurate tools for analyzing historical circumstances, especially those in proximity to the lecture itself in time. It is too situated. It stages an intervention in intellectual discussions of what science ought to be, rather than offering analysis of how those discussions were developed and why. And that's problematic for us because this very period would also provide an astonishingly productive time in the history of science and how it was related to religion, leading to significant conceptual shifts in fields ranging from fundamental physics to cosmology to biology and psychology. And indeed, many of those who contributed to these developments would count among the big children that Weber ridiculed. Notions of spirituality, of a spiritually attuned new science that would re-emerge in the post-war period were in fact created in the interwar years and often by the very scientists and popularisers of the science who produced this. So how can we then best represent these developments? In previous work, I have suggested that we must avoid seeing disenchantment as the given outcome of rationalization processes. More importantly, the spectre of disenchantment, which did indeed come with the ascent of scientific and I think especially technical expertise in society, posed a series of intellectual problems to which people, specifically learned people, responded in various ways. So in this view, the positions that we've seen on epistemology, axiology, and metaphysics that we encountered in Weber's lecture, they do not so much point to unquestionable conditions for science, as much as they point to problem areas that let us identify central debates and conflicts in and around science at the time, how it's being negotiated, its boundaries. So then we have questions like, are there incalculable powers in nature or are there not? Can values be derived from fact, and in which case, how? And is a scientific metaphysics possible? So these questions, they were increasingly being asked in the interwar period, and there are historical reasons why, and now I'm going to shift to talk more about sort of extraneous factors for why and how this happened. So one of those is that the public perception of science changed in the wake of the Great War. Science was increasingly being associated with industry and military technology, cast as a dehumanizing force and a central pillar of all that was wrong or had gone wrong with modern civilization. Weber's lecture was itself a response to this condition in the form of a defense of pure science. A different sort of response was given by scientists busy with emerging fields like quantum physics, cosmology, or even radioactivity research. They popularized these scientists popularized the sharp distinction between the old classical physics, which they described as mechanistic, materialistic, and reductionist, and an exciting new physics, which they portrayed as more philosophical and able to address the big questions of human existence. So the historian of science Paul Foreman has argued that quantum physicists of the early 1920s actively accommodated to a post-war, so that is interwar zeitgeist, by emphasizing worldview implications from their research that were either not warranted or at least not necessitated by it. So they added something to this to make it more interesting. And this was notably the case with notions or criticisms of notions such as causality and determinism. So Werner Heisenberg's seminal paper on the uncertainty principle, for example, published in 1927, went so far as to say, so in the scientific paper itself, that quantum mechanics had abolished causality once and for all, while Niels Bohr's formulations of complementarity, which were adjusted according to the audience a little bit, sometimes presented this both and logic of the mutually exclusive wave and particle models as being an irreducible feature of the world itself, and just kind of showing this mysterious world that we don't know anything about. These arguments suggested that science cannot, even in principle, calculate the outcome of certain future states, so it also curtails this epistemic optimism. And moreover, they stressed the interconnection between the observer and the observed, so allowing for more subjectivity in science, or at least that's the idea you would get. So even though they philosophically actually developed a lot of these points based on logical positivism and tried to sell it into the Vienna circle, in their public lectures, people like Bohr and Heisenberg, and in their publications for the wider market, they would also connect these principles to a much wider range of questions, so including free will, metaphysics, and even the relationship between cultures, as Bohr did in front of Danish anthropologists. And some other quantum physicists of this generation, like Pascal Jordan, would take it all a step further and linking observer effects to subjective idealism or indeterminism to vitalism and parapsychology. So the public of all this could be forgiven for thinking that the shift to probabilistic models in quantum mechanics meant a full-scale resurgence of mysterious incalculable powers. Okay, so I mentioned anti-intellectual atmosphere as one reason for why this kind of became successful, but I wanted to mention two other important factors. One of them is the rise of popular science as a commercially successful genre of literature, developing in tandem with the rise of science fiction. And unlike early science fiction, popular science was often written by leading scientists, and it was a crucial medium for rebranding the new physics. For example, the leading British cosmologist James Jeans published a popular science book in 1930 entitled The Mysterious Universe, containing also in its final chapter some idealistic speculations on the primacy of consciousness and the mind of God, and also replete with references to Plato and Pythagoreanism and idealists like George Berkeley. The other factor is the creation of institutional spaces in the shape of societies and lecture series that encouraged such speculations. I'm not going to say anything about the Society for Psychical Research, which I had planned to do, and also nothing about the Alchemical Society, which is a fascinating little group. But more importantly, we have institutions like the Gifford Lectures, which was founded precisely to encourage leading scholars to reflect on natural theology, by which the founder, Lord Adam Gifford, meant the knowledge of God, the infinite, the all, treated as a strictly natural science, the greatest of all possible sciences. So, just a quick running off of the Gifford Lectures. This lecture series would become a very important space. Its beginnings were rather humble. One of the first Gifford lecturers said that the honor is not great, but the honorarium is enormous. And over time, this honorarium would also buy honor, because all of these major scientists would come there and lecture, and philosophers, William James and Henri Bergson and so on, and Bohr and Heisenberg. And so my point here is that instead of committing an intellectual sacrifice, these would-be big children who lectured here responded to the problem of disenchantment in other ways, attempted to connect science to values and to metaphysics, or by challenging deterministic and mechanistic conceptions of life. And the resulting publications, which were born from real conceptual tensions and from broader cultural concerns of the early 20th century science, would in turn become a referential corpus for re-enchantment advocates in the latter half of the 20th century. So there's this kind of historical connection which goes back to the heart of science itself. Okay, thank you.
Is there a revolution in the role of the mind, as Maurice Biermann was talking, or maybe only wishing?
Well, one of the, I think, funny things about people like Biermann is you're not quite sure if he, we are so pessimistic, you're not quite sure that he believes that this can actually happen, or he doesn't know exactly how it could happen, because this revolution that he talks about, adopting some kind of holistic worldview, is very clear that this cannot come about by returning to the past. It cannot come about by reinventing alchemy or animism or something like that. It has to be something else, and you need organizational spaces for that, new ways of organizing society as a whole.
So, but he wrote this 40 years ago. What has happened since then?
What has happened since then? Well, look at the world. I don't know. Well, the ideas are popular, obviously. But
and you coined the phrase a new spiritual science. Is that happening?
Well, there are people who would claim that it is happening. I think my impression is that this the discussion about the possibilities of some other implications of science are very much the same today as they were 40 years ago, as they were in the 20s and 30s. So there's kind of a continuity in this perception of science, its limitations and its possibilities, which is constantly reinvented with new theories as the grounding for it, and connected to new areas and so on.
Is there a growing distrust of science when people look more to values than to facts?
Oh, that's a big one. It's a big one.
Big one, yes. Give me a small answer.
Well, I think that the idea that the expert systems, including the expert systems of science, are crumbling is a bit overblown, despite the so-called rising conspiracy theories and so on. Seems to be fairly stable as well, but maybe some of these critiques and these voices are more visible now than they were 20 years ago.
Thank you very much, Egil, for this.
Thank you.